We will now begin our first panel discussion of the day, a retrospective look at the last 50 years in the environmental movement. I think this is a good way of following what Olivier said about what the Canadian government is doing. So it's important to know what has been done until now. The discussion will be moderated by Dr. Jean Andrey, Dean of the Faculty of the Environment at the University of Waterloo. And the panelists are Anne-Josée Laquerre, Executive Director and co-founder of Québec Net Positive, Elizabeth May, Member of Parliament for Saanich Gulf Islands and Parliamentary Leader of the Green Caucus.
Avant de lancer la discussion, nous allons écouter un petit bienvenue de l'Honourable ministre de l'Environnement du Changement.
Before we begin the discussion, we're going to hear a short welcome from the Honourable Stephen Guilbeault, Minister of the Environment and Climate Change.
Good morning, everyone. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. I'm pleased to join you from Ottawa, which is on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people, a place that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst many First Nations. À titre de ministre de l'Environnement et du Changement climatique, je suis extrêmement heureux de connaître des personnes de tous les horizons se rassembler autour d'un objectif
gather around a common objective to find solutions to some of the greatest challenges that our society is being confronted with. I've worked in many parts of the environmental movement throughout my adult life, and one of the essential ingredients to tackle climate change and other major environmental challenges is cooperation at all levels.
The last 2 years of pandemic life has shown us just how interconnected we are, despite our physical isolation. While the COVID-19 pandemic brought us together, it also highlighted certain inequalities and injustices. That's one reason why the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are so important. They take a whole-of-society approach to making the world a better place, examining the interconnected impacts of health, education, social equality, greener ways of living. Je suis fier de me joindre à vous aujourd'hui pour célébrer 50 ans de progrès mondiaux dans le domaine de l'environnement. Nous avons parcouru beaucoup de chemin. Le Canada a été un chef de file sur les plans des réalisations environnementales. En 1971, le Canada est devenu le deuxième pays au monde à établir officiellement le ministère de l'Environnement. Alors que Environnement et Changement climatique Canada célébrait son 50e anniversaire
celebrated its 50th anniversary last year. The Canada Weather Service was celebrating its 150th year of existence. The main steps of this department describe the progress made. In 1977, we created the Committee on Species in Peril. In 1985, within the program against acid rain in eastern Canada, the government committed to protect the lakes and rivers that were vulnerable. The same year, the government adopted the Act on Water Resources in Canada to better manage the water resources. In 1999, the Canadian Act on the Protection of the Environment was promulgated to protect the environment and prevent pollution. These important legislative measures became the foundations of today's ambitious objectives, that is, to become carbon neutral by 2050, to ensure the conservation of 30% of lands and oceans by 2030, to eliminate the production and exportation of coal by 2030, and work to adopt cleaner technologies in an equitable fashion for the consumers and the producers.
Canada has also demonstrated its leadership internationally. Consider our continuing role with the United Nations Environment Program. Some of you may know that the late Canadian businessman and diplomat Maurice Strong was instrumental in the creation of UNEP 50 years ago and became the organization's first executive director. This was not the only time that Canada was at the center of the world's environmental stage. In 1987, the Montreal Protocol, the landmark agreement to phase out substances destroying the ozone layer, came into effect. The protocol remains the only UN treaty ever ratified by all 198 member states. Canadians can be proud of what our country has achieved. Since 2015, we've worked hard to implement the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development at home, including through the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy. With the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals in mind, our latest draft Federal Sustainable Development Strategy reflects Canadians' higher expectations and includes time-bound, measurable targets to achieve real results. La stratégie tient compte de toutes les grandes initiatives environnementales.
This strategy takes into account all of the major environmental goals established, linked between the reinforced strategic plan, the upcoming adaptation strategy, the Canadian action plan to eliminate plastic waste, and the strategy for a green government. I'm happy to say that the preliminary version of the upcoming strategy 2022 to 2027 will that the people will be consulted about this strategy. We will thus be able to move forward further and more quickly.
Climate change is real, that the need for a sustainable world is urgent. People are experiencing the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation firsthand. The pandemic has been a time for us to come together. We've witnessed the interconnectedness of key pillars of our society: health, social well-being, the economy, and the environment. We must apply the same principle to solve climate and environmental emergencies of our day while promoting peace, dignity, and equality on a healthy planet. Let's see how much further we can go when we work together.
Well, hello, everyone. It's my thrill to chair this panel discussion with our three distinguished guests. And a quick thank you to Chuk for having introduced us all briefly, and also to Minister Guilbeault for having joined us and having reminded us about some of the important roles that Canada has played in the environmental movement. I'm calling in today from the University of Waterloo, which is situated on the Haldimand Tract, and this is land that was promised to the Six Nations of the Grand River. You know, the inspiration for today's panel discussion was some of the anniversaries that have occurred in the last few years around some of the environmental movements that began in the 1970s. And, you know, many of you know that environmentalism in the form of land conservation, for example, and parkland creation started much earlier than our time period. It began in the 1800s in earnest. But many people would say that our modern environmental movement began with the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962, and her fight against DDT and insecticides that were having ravaging effects on our ecosystems. And the lesson, of course, that Rachel Carson taught us that we know well now is that everything is connected. And so that what looked to be solutions, sometimes miracles, I think as DDT was referred to, often turn out to be naive approaches that introduce systemic problems that are difficult to resolve. And, you know, whenever I think about Rachel Carson and indeed some of the work that our distinguished guest, Elizabeth May, and others have done, on this whole pesticide business, I'm reminded of my own environmental awakening. I was raised on a small farm in Bruce County, and I remember the debates at the table of my parents when pesticides began to be used. And I remember them talking about these poisons and whether or not they should be used on our land. And these are some of the debates that gave rise to this first environmental movement. So just a couple of comments about a couple of the anniversaries that our globe has celebrated recently. Many of you know that Earth Day came out of this first movement, created in 1970. And so we'll be looking at our 52nd Earth Day this coming spring in April. And it started as a set of teach-ins on university campuses. And of course, it was organized very well. And initially then in that first year attracted an audience of about 10% of the American population at the time, which is quite remarkable. And it's gone on now to engage about 1 billion people around the world every year that we celebrate Earth Day. And the other anniversary that I wanted to point out relates to Greenpeace, one of the largest and most present environmental activist groups. And of course, that was formed in 1971 here in Canada, off the coast of British Columbia, when an old fishing boat renamed the Greenpeace took sail to try to put a halt to the nuclear weapons testing in the Pacific. And while the specific sailing venture didn't end up as they had planned, of course, it led to one of the largest movements that we have now, with Greenpeace having about 3 million members worldwide. So this is such a long history that we have, and I think it's important when we talk about the SDGs, which have these three pillars and all the intersections, to also remember some of the places that we've come from and how they maybe foretell or put us in a position about where we go forward to. And so that is sort of why we're here. And I'm really happy that most of the talking from now on is going to be by our panelists. And I'm going to begin then by asking Elizabeth May if she'll maybe speak to our first question. And I'll go around to the others because I'll also give you a chance to get to know them a little. But my first question is, I just like our panelists to give us a short synopsis of how and why they got involved in the environmental movement and what has sustained their commitment on this. And so over to Elizabeth May. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jean. I have to start by acknowledging the territory that I'm on today. I'm on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Nation, where Parliament Hill sits on the lands of the Algonquin people. My riding, Saanich Gulf Islands, Saanich is an Anglicism for the Senchothan word for the nation where I live and represent in Parliament, which is Wasanic. So I raised my hands to you, Haishka Siem, which is the traditional greeting of the people of the Wasanic Nation. Look, as we go through this, I think I may be the only panelist who's participated in all the seminal events of this 50 years process. I got involved in the environmental movement over the Mchitka issue. I think that was my first active engagement, was petitions in my high school to halt the Mchitka tests. That was in 1970. And I organized in my high school in grade 10 for the first Earth Day, April 22nd, 1970. I didn't go to Stockholm for 1972 and the first conference on the human environment. Minister Guilbeault mentioned that the seminal role played by Maurice Strong, Canadian. And Maurice was, of course, the Secretary General of both the Stockholm meeting in 1972 and the Rio Earth Summit in 1992 that I did attend. There's been a lot of Canadian engagement in the work at the UN level, and a lot of it because of the leadership of people like the late Maurice Strong and the late Jim McNeill, who was Secretary General of the Brundtland Commission report, Our Common Future, that came out in 1987, just as we were on the brink of completing the negotiations for the Montreal Protocol that Stephen did mention, that protected and saved the ozone layer and that worked. So I guess I can't really answer the question, Jean. I have absolutely no idea why I'm an environmentalist. It's like asking me, why do you breathe? Have you ever thought about it? I don't have any idea. It's exactly why I breathe. And I do, and I know I'm going to continue to be an environmentalist. And I really don't think I have any more choice about this work than I do to continue breathing. We are in a perilous moment, despite 50 years of events in which governments proclaim we're going to do something about saving the environment, ending poverty. All the sustainable development goals in a lot of ways were wrapped up in Agenda 21 that was agreed upon in 1992 in Rio, and which right now we have a very large threat in disinformation of a global right-wing fascist group that has actually contaminated the so-called Freedom Convoy that was fed by disinformation from the same people who don't want us to fight the climate crisis, who don't want global equity, who don't want anti-racism policy. They're getting the upper hand. I have to say, I'm very concerned at the extent of the disinformation about all of the issues that are completely interlinked. But the idea, and you'll find it easily, if you Google Agenda 21, you'll find a sewage pit of allegations of global conspiracies about the elites trying to, take our freedom, take our money. So be aware of that. But back in 1972, so I'm going to end my opening with this, was 1972 at the Stockholm first UN conference on the human environment. That's where Margaret Mead spoke to the non-government civil society section of Stockholm. That's where she said, never doubt that a small group of committed and engaged citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Those are still the watchwords for all of us, and I don't think we have any choice but to fight harder than ever because the threats are more severe than ever.
Thank you for those inspiring comments and for reminding us about many of the events. And I know some of the people who are joining us today are probably of our generation, but there will be others who are much younger. And I think one of the most important things we want to do is we want to motivate them to address these issues in their own ways, but also to understand some of where it came from and how that can leverage them and move them forward. So powerful words, and thank you for reminding us about that. So now I'm gonna go to Bob Gibson now, who's a colleague of mine. He'll probably bring a slightly different perspective, but perhaps a similar era of involvement, and perhaps as natural as you in breathing environmentalism in everything he does. So over to Bob now.
Thanks, Jean, and thanks, Elizabeth. Good to see you again. I don't operate at the ethereal levels of global activity that Elizabeth has been involved in, but I have sort of stumbled into the environment in an accidental way over time. I had decades of schooling that had no greenery in it whatsoever, but I eventually studied philosophy and political economy, and I learned about reason and power, which have always been pretty crucial. But nobody employs you to do that work, and so not intentionally anyway. And so I did a whole series of short-term employment adventures throughout the 1970s. I started with national science policy and did a review of a development / assimilation project on Baffin Island. I worked for Environment Canada on environmental management, and I worked for the Labrador Inuit Association on a proposed uranium mine on the coast. I worked for an environmental organization setting up a newspaper, and I did some studies on acid rain and on pollution abatement, control, order, enforcement. And those sort of accidental and diverse things eventually gave me enough anecdotes and a network of friends to get a job in an environment program that allowed me to continue the adventures and call it research. This has always been an enormous fun. And I've learned an enormous amount, mostly from my colleagues, about the two basic things that are crucial in environment. And one is most obvious, that the environment is crucial and imperiled increasingly. And the second is that there's very little you can do about that will be useful and lasting without addressing the other crimes and stupidities that we are now trying to confront with the Sustainable Development Goals. I think that's probably the story.
Okay, thank you, Bob, and thank you for reminding us about acid rain, of course, which is was an issue that was so powerfully important in Canada and in Scandinavia and other areas as we had transatlantic travel of pollution at a time where we thought we could only maybe have local effects. And also, Elizabeth, I think you talked about sort of the ozone depletion, and again, these were the times where we were recognizing that everything we did was global, whereas I think we often began by thinking we were dealing with local or maybe regional issues. So thank you for sharing those stories, Bob. Okay, now I'm going to ask Anne-Josée to join us and bring her perspective about how and why she got involved and what sustains her commitment.
Thank you very much, Jean. So on my side, I work at Québec Net Positive. So our job is really to mobilize the business community. So I'm going to tell you about how I got involved in the environment in the business community, because I think that's what is my take to this panel. First of all, it's my personal family values for sure. We were really close to nature. My grandfather was a farmer. He had a sugar shack. So very young, I saw the magic of nature, like we were one with nature at the sugar shack, and having this experience every spring was like just magic. I did 10 years in the Girl Guides movement. So we were really close to nature for sure. But then I studied, I did a college degree in science, and then I went in business. And then I started working in large companies, and I chose the natural resources sector because I'm close to nature, and I thought that would all make sense. So I worked 7 years at Noranda, which was the largest mining company in Canada at the time. We had 103,000 employees worldwide. And I worked in the public affairs team. And what I realized is in public affairs team, we were dealing with health and safety issues of our employees, environmental issues of the company, reclaiming old mining sites, things that were done at a time where science didn't have the same knowledge as when I was working there. And understanding the impact of mining companies at one point, and was like a shock for me to even think, should I stay in a company or should I move to be an activist? Because these companies, I mean, when they go there, they have a huge impact on ecosystem and biodiversity. And am I comfortable working in a company that has such a huge impact? And at the time in Africa, there were mining sites that were like with no environmental reclaiming at all, no concern for health and safety of staff. And I saw Noranda taking care of their community and, doing some research. They had a research center on mining automation and how to have less impact on the environment. And at that point, I kind of decided in my head, you know what, if the world is going to need metals and some companies are going to dig this metal from the ground, might as well be from a company that tries to do it with the least possible impact or is concerned about that impact and trying to do something about it. And then I worked for 7 years at Noranda, and then I worked in pulp and paper at Domtar, so a good 10 years in natural resources sector. Then I worked for 10 years in manufacturing, so I worked for Merck Frost, I worked 7 years at Bombardier Aerospace, then I worked for services companies at EMEA, we were doing loyalty programs. In all my career, more and more, I went into sustainability because I realized that as we were working on sustainability issues, it was engaging employees. And I learned that companies have a huge impact, yes, on the environment, but climate change has a huge impact on every company. And depending on the sector where you're working, material issues are different. But one thing that is common everywhere is that every company can be part of the solution. There's a lot of natural resources in the hands of companies. They need to be conscious of that. They need to take care of those resources. And they need people like myself, and we are a whole range of people that have been recognized throughout Canada, working in companies, helping companies be profitable, be good, great employers, and at the same time create environmental impact and social impact in their community that is positive. So really that has sustained my commitment that companies can be part of the solution, has sustained my commitment over the years.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Anne-Josée. So now, everyone, you've gotten to know our panelists a little bit, and so I'm going to move on to some additional questions where they'll reflect a little bit more on the environmental movement. And so I'm going to ask Bob to start this one off, but it's really about the experiences that you're bringing in different sectors and what some of the main achievements and what some of the main failings have been from your point of view. So what are the achievements, the learnings? And what are the failings or the places where we seem to have gotten stuck? So Bob, you want to share a little bit?
I find that I have to be going back in time quite often to remind myself of how far we've come when it's so frustrating how little we're getting done at the moment. I suspect Elizabeth is nodding. It's in the same world. In 1972, as some of you have mentioned already, the world was profoundly different from what it is today, although some of the insights that we still haven't acted upon were visible then. At that time, we are still at the very beginnings of getting used to having social safety nets and trying to maintain them. We were at the very beginning of environmental law, at the very beginning of ministries that called themselves environmental. And there was at the very beginning of discussions about environment and development and how you could do those at the same time. I know George Francis, our
learned colleague worked on that with the UN in the 1960s, but it was still a pretty fresh topic for most people at that time. And over the intervening 50 years, I think it's fair to say we have learned an enormous amount about how to wrestle with those questions more sensibly, the various dimensions and possible responses, and about the enormous complexities of the world. Some of the most important advances in the last 50 years have been in social ecological complex system studies and understanding the enormous difficulty of understanding what's going on, the enormous risks that are involved in intervening, and the enormous potential of positive feedbacks and combined actions, which we have not yet really incorporated very much in practice, which is the big frustration, I think. But the learning in those areas is very impressive and very rich. I suppose at the same time, we'd have to admit that the problems are so much worse now than they were then. And consequently, we've had to move from trying to mitigate the damage and protect a few places to having to make profound shifts towards different trajectories. The whole bit about sustainability is no longer mitigation. It's about going in different directions from the way we're going now. And there's probably more to say about that, but I think that that set of problems has been accompanied by sets of learnings that we've got lots and lots to draw from.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Just, interestingly, a few minutes ago, Anne-Josée was talking about the interconnectedness of things, and you've reminded us about the same in terms of things like combined actions and feedback loops. And thank you for reminding us that in some ways, while it's so frustrating where we are, we actually have learned a great deal and begun to see change. And as all of our speakers have said, we've begun to see it in every part of society. And that does give us hope to move forward. But as you've also said, Bob, it seems that the issues are more complex, that because of perhaps the global population, technology, the scale of business, the nature of capitalism, all these things also mean that the challenges seem to be growing. So it is a challenging time. Maybe Elizabeth can share us a little bit as well that will tell us about where there's been learnings and where there's been failures. So over to Elizabeth, and then I'll come to you, Anne-Josée, again.
Okay, thanks, Jean. First of all, I want to apologize because you found me in the room that I could find outside of Parliament to sit to try to do this, because there's a debate right now that I'd like to be in. It's an idiotic debate because the Conservative Party motion today for a full day's debate is that in the interest of helping Ukraine, we need to build pipelines. So I've been enjoying the comments from the NDP, the Liberals, and the Bloc, all saying the Ukraine has not asked us for pipelines. They have asked for many things, but the opportunistic effort once again to push fossil fuels forward in this humanitarian crisis, in this rising up of a nuclear threat again from the evil, I think Vladimir Putin, I will use the word evil, to threaten nuclear war and to invade a democracy. This is the context we're in right now. We're just right outside of the doors of this small room with overhead lighting, not as lovely as where we find Bob in Waterloo with a plant. What I would give for a plant. Okay, learnings. And this is going to not be what you expect, perhaps, Jean. I had far more environmental successes in the 70s and 80s than now, and in the early part of the 1990s. In the 70s, as an activist on Cape Breton Island, I was with a group of farmers and woodlot owners. We were able to stop the government of Nova Scotia from spraying insecticides over the whole province. We stopped the spraying later of herbicide, Agent Orange. We succeeded in blocking uranium mining. I left Nova Scotia after getting a law degree, went to work in the government of Canada, and from that perspective, in the minister's office, stopped acid rain. Yeah, and saved Guayahana, stopped the logging of the southern third of Haida Gwaii, and created many national parks in the 2 years I was in government. Astonishing. Negotiated the Montreal Protocol. I was part of the negotiating team in 1987 with the Montreal Protocol. So what are my learnings? The rise of neoliberalism squashed us, and we didn't see it. The rise of the corporate control, the rise of things like Chapter 11 of NAFTA, to say that foreign corporations have the right to sue governments if we cut into their profits. This was accepted. It just crept up on us. Why is it that the Montreal Protocol to save the ozone layer worked? Maybe because it included sanctions that were effective. If a country violated the Montreal Protocol, it faced legal trade sanctions from every other member of the protocol, which was all nations on earth. And that was because Mustafa Tolba, who was then the head of the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, when pressured by trade minister people, said, tell them to go away. Tell them we don't, they said, you can't have environmental measures get in the way of global trade. And Mustafa Tolba and UNEP said, we're not going to let you get in the way of us saving the world. What happened? Through the Uruguay round, we negotiated the World Trade Organization, trade über alles, and we ended up losing. That's why the Kyoto Protocol had no sanctions or enforcement mechanisms. That's why the Paris Agreement has no enforcement mechanisms. They left environmental treaties to use, while the trade negotiators got power tools. The really good, hard, sharp things were left for trade negotiations. Environmental negotiations, we got those little plastic rounded scissors that kids get to use in Sunday school. My lessons learned are, we let corporate power trump democracy. And the use of a verb trump is not inappropriate in this case. We have been sandbagged by some really large autocratic threatening institutions that include big oil. So we need to radicalize. We need to say, look, we're not going to let you bastards destroy our future. I'm sorry, we have to be harder, stronger, fiercer, and not allow ourselves to be co-opted into even friendly governments with nice ministers. We have to be tougher.
That's a strong message. Thank you for sharing it and sharing it so powerfully. And thank you for reminding us about the importance of levers. I think we often think that civic discourse will be enough and that perhaps a national or a local policy will be enough. But I think you remind us the levers need to be bigger, and they often need to be very powerful levers in order to put things in place and actually keep things in place. And also thank you, Elizabeth, for wearing the Ukrainian colors today. Okay, over to Anne-Josée. Tell us how, from your perspective about some of the achievements, some of the frustrations.
Yeah, that was a really good question, and I was listening to Elizabeth, and I think that from being inside corporations, what I've learned is that it's not like a monolithic block of people or entities that are all acting the same way. So, for example, in Quebec, we have the Cascade company. They are doing pulp and paper, but they're using like urban fibers. So they recycle. They started their company in 1964 at a time where people were not really thinking necessarily about the environment. And they kept their commitment, moving to sustainable supply chain, reusing every drop of water. I think it's 70 times in their process. It's one of the best thing they do. And so they are experts in energy efficiency. And this company still exists today. And they were last year by Corporate Knights, they were on the 17th on the top 100 list of the most responsible company in the world. And that's a Quebec company that started in 1964. So we do have some examples of companies that are trying to meet the needs of people while doing things in the best possible way. But of course, as Elizabeth mentioned, the fact that the development of the economy is a lot linked to fossil fuels has been really destructive. So what I did is I kind of went in my head and thought, okay, I cannot go back too much 50 years. I'm 54, so I was quite young. But I would say that from the 80s to the 1999 like kind of thing, this 20 year there, companies were basically reacting. Some of them, it was an awakening call about the environmental impact their company was having, their operations. A lot of leaders didn't know at the time. But the fact that you talk about it, Jean, Greenpeace was there, showing companies the impact they were having. There was really this reaction. And in that time was the Montreal Protocol. And also, I'm not going to repeat all these things, but all these things contributed for companies to actually take stance of saying, hey, I can no longer use the environment in any way. I'm going to have to comply. So there was at least this compliance piece that got in. And I would say the 10 years following 2000 to 2009, this is where I think companies went beyond just reacting. They went to the respect phase, where it was not only about the environment, but also being more and more conscious about the social impact of the environment. And this is when sustainable development got really, as a word was created, really got into way. And in that period, we started to have the United Nations Global Compact coming in. Companies started to subscribe to the Global Compact and the 10 principles behind that. So that was a period where I think companies got, really more respect. In the 2010 to 2019, that decenny, I call it the ACT. So it was no longer about, okay, I'm just reacting to this and I'm going to respect, but companies started to be really more proactive. So those who wanted to act really started to measure their greenhouse gas emission, report on the CDP, their environmental impact. So there was more and more data being gathered, a little bit more transparency. Data was available to investors as well. So investors and sustainable finance was more and more developing. And in that period, in Quebec, we had our carbon market that was done with California. So the largest emitters were really informed about the fact that they needed to do something. Paris Agreement came. So there was a lot of work that was done. And the TCFD with Mark Carney playing a huge role on the international space for a transparency around environmental impact was really important for companies. It's really kind of pushing and setting a stance for that. And in 2019, to finish that destiny, there was in the United States about 200 CEOs that signed the Business Roundtable. And what they said is, it's not true that our company should exist only to give profits and benefits to our shareholders. Companies have another purpose, and the purpose of a company is for giving benefits to all of its stakeholders and ensuring that all of its stakeholders will be able to grow, and this includes taking care of the environment. So in 2019, just before the pandemic, it was the first time where we saw all these CEOs together signing something that says, hey, the purpose of a corporation is well beyond giving profits to our shareholders. And this leads to our destiny right now, the 2020 to 2030. For me, it's no longer about acting, but it's about uniting our efforts. Unite is the most important thing right now. We saw it with the pandemic. Robert was talking about it before, and with this interconnection. This is where we really see businesses as a potential force for good if we do work together with civil society, with governments, and we are taking part of the solution. And I think what is the most important right now is all the mobilization around sustainable finance. It's $121 trillion on a global scale of investors that have said, I'm no longer going to invest in a company that does not take care of the environment, that is unaware of its footprint. So this is going to really be pushing. And what I see forward from 2030 to 2050, what we see is that some companies will even be part of a regenerative movement. So not only going to net zero emissions, but thinking about how can I give more to the planet than what I take from it. And so we are already seeing this, the sustainable brands movement are already calling the 2020s the regenerative 20s. So there's a huge potential for the companies who want to do good. And as you mentioned before, a small number of people can do a big change. So my hope is that by having some leading companies going in that direction, it will eventually trigger a movement away from this old economy where companies were essentially competing, taking some natural resources for short-term profits, and will actually be collaborating together and even cooperating, as we like to see, the cooperation between competitors when it's for the good of everyone. It needs to happen, and it starts to happen more and more. So,
Maybe before you go, Anne-Josée, let me ask a question. It kind of links with a question that's just come in from one in our audience, but it also links with some of my thinking. Like I was thinking when I was a kid growing up, I remember my parents talking about their farm, not as something that they were trying to exploit in order to get a maximum return, but as something that they were earning a living on at the same time as they were protecting it for future generations. You know, did we lose our way along the way and we're coming back to it? And this kind of links to the question that's just come in saying, okay, companies are acting now. I mean, you know, I'm saying maybe there was a period where they weren't so much, but are they acting enough? Does it match the complexity, do you think, of the challenges that are facing us? So I like the way you went through some time periods, but I wonder if I could just push you just a little bit more.
It's very interesting. I think that actually some of the people that are in business are going this way, saying a business has a purpose. Is the purpose of this business actually aligned with a world that is just 1.5 degree warming? Is it a purpose that makes sense? And this farm example that you give was not a company, was the purpose of the family. They had a farm. And so we have the B Corp movement right now that have more than 3,000 companies, I think, worldwide, who are really purposeful companies. But some companies are relooking at their purpose and restating their purpose and making sure that their purpose will make sense. So I think that's important. The other thing is that no company, and I will come back on what Robert said about the transition trajectories. This is transition pathways. This is very, very important. Right now, every company has the responsibility to place themselves on a transition pathway that will be compatible with a low carbon future. Every decision, almost every business decision, is also a climate decision these days. So this needs to take place. And I think that the environment in which companies operate is very important. So no company will succeed in placing itself on a transition pathway alone. Companies operate in a business environment. So there's something collective about the transition. Like we had our farms when we were young, it was not every farm that was producing everything. Some were better at doing the milk and they would exchange with other farmer around and everybody. So it's the same in these value chains need to move towards the right trajectory together. So there's a collective to it. So when you ask, is it possible for companies to do it? There's a collective to it. There's also the political and policies environment. So I think one of your questions was, what are the greatest failing? I think for me, I put measuring the success of world economies based solely on the growth of GDP. That's a huge failing. And right now we are realizing this, and the SDGs are a great way to look beyond GDP solely, but this is putting pressure for companies to be growing all the time without any consideration for the environmental footprint and planetary boundaries. So that's a huge failing on top of the fossil fuel that Elizabeth and Bob mentioned. And I would like to say also that when you talk about a farm, you talk about a small, medium-sized business. And I think we have put a lot of emphasis on the role of the big emitters, the big companies. We need to help all of our small businesses to adapt to climate change right now, because if the bigger companies can adapt and change and the smaller are not being helped, they're not going to be resilient in a low carbon future. And this is going to be very problematic for our communities. So we need to be working with all sizes of businesses, not only those that are on the stakeholder market or with huge investors.
Okay, thank you so much. Very, very lots of rich thinking there. And just a quick aside before we go to the next question, but you talked about GDP and the limitations of that. This is for any of you who are in the audience who are from the Waterloo region. We're going to be holding some activities on campus later this month around the Gross National Happiness Index, and we're going to be having the original architect of that come visit us here on campus. And so that should be a way to look at progress in a different way.
Jean, I don't know if I may on that. There's a group of people in Quebec that has just published the 70 or I think it's 60 indicators of happiness in Quebec, what should go beyond GDP. So we do have that, was published just very recently.
That's fantastic. I'll follow up and maybe get a link to that so that we can learn more about that as well. That's wonderful. Okay, so that leaves me in a little bit of a hopeful mood to ask the next question, and I'll maybe ask Elizabeth to start it off. But, I think we should think about today because, we've done a nice retrospective, but, we want to be sure that what's happening now will set the course for the next decade, that we don't lose this moment, that we actually are able to make progress maybe in ways that we thought we weren't able to achieve in the past. So, Elizabeth, can you share a few thoughts there?
Well, I have a hard time, Jean, with the notion that we could lose the moment without thinking about, do we have a moment? One, I'm looking at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, which came out this week, and that's Working Group 2. Working Group 1 came out in August 2021. We know that to hold to 1.5 degrees global average temperature increase above what it was before the Industrial Revolution, which, by the way, by the time you get through saying that, most people's eyes have glazed over. But that is the target that we adopted in the Paris Agreement. That is the target to which Canada is not, and I repeat, not committed. We have changed our targets in legislation and in rhetoric to net zero by 2050, which is only consistent with holding to 1.5 degrees if we do most of the heavy lifting in this decade. And that gets lost when people say, including our government, that net zero by 2050 is the target. Corporations are signing up, oh yeah, net zero by 2050 is great. We'll all be dead. We can leave someone else to deal with the fact that we didn't get to net zero. We need absolute zero. And the idea that we can set our targets off to 2050. So when I look at this, Jean, we have a moment in terms of, as the IPCC said this week, we have a rapidly closing window. And I remind people, 1.5 degrees sounds pretty abstract. We're at 1.1 degrees Celsius global average temperature increase right now. And this summer for British Columbians was not a pleasant summer. We had a heat dome that killed nearly 600 British Columbians in 4 days. We had a fire. We had we had thousands of fires across British Columbia, but the one that took out Lytton burnt so fast that the fire truck didn't get out of the fire station before the center of town burnt to the ground. It was in minutes. And we had, of course, the fall set of events of extreme, atmospheric rivers, as they're called, that took out major infrastructure. Every single land link between the rest of British Columbia and Vancouver was wiped out. Everyone. And so rebuilding highways, the billions of dollars of that cost and the loss of life. And by the way, we've got friends and family through my husband whose place has always been up in the Upper Thompson and the Bonaparte, that part of dry land, British Columbia, true desert. That's my husband's territory. And we have friends that have places there. And when we say in those floods in November, they lost their farm, they didn't just lose their farm building and their animals. They had a 7-acre farm. Most of the land the farm was on fell into the river. They lost the land their farm was on. These are catastrophic events, life-changing events that have killed people in my home province in large number at 1.1 degree Celsius. So lest we think that 1.5 degrees is some kind of utopia, no matter what, we're headed for very dangerous times. And our government keeps acting as though it's possible to expand fossil fuel industries, expand production, and somehow later take a deep dive to net zero. We've got to be much more vigilant on this stuff. We've got to call them out and say, no, you can't approve any more fossil fuel development. You can't complete, right now, at least Minister of Finance, Chrystia Freeland, is saying, okay, no more public money into the Trans Mountain Pipeline, having squandered billions on that climate killing pipeline. We've got to be much more vocal across the country. I'm begging everyone on this call to be more vocal and say clearly, cancel the Trans Mountain Pipeline. We own it. It's a crown corporation. Don't look around to find private sector money to keep it going. And most cynical of all, don't figure out a way to sell it to some indigenous business. When the Tsleil-Waututh, the Musqueam, the Squamish, all the First Nations in my territory, everyone's saying, don't build it. We don't want more tankers loaded with dilbit, which can't be cleaned up. These are fundamental issues. Canada is still the worst performer in the G7. And we're being beguiled into some kind of happy complacency. And I hate to say it, it's affected the environmental movement too. People should be up in arms that we haven't canceled the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And arms, I mean, I'm a pacifist, so I'm not really talking about being up in arms. These arms, not weapons. But we have absolutely been far too accepting of rhetoric in place of action. And we really must be prepared to do more. So yes, we have a moment in the sense that the window hasn't closed yet on 1.5 degrees Celsius. But I have a hard time finding scientists who are prepared to accept that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is correct and saying we can still hold to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That opportunity that we still can claim the window is not completely closed yet, that has a lifespan on it. That is a best before date. You can measure in months, not years. We have to move faster, and we have to do way more.
You know, Elizabeth, 30 years ago, there was sort of an alternative energy path for Canada. It came out. You might remember I remember the cover was black and it had some orange on it, and it laid out all the paths, everything from tidal, in Nova Scotia, all the way to the geothermal in the west. Like, where is that conversation about? Because Canada is rich in energy of all kinds. So how have we lost? Like, even now, we focus on the fossil fuel problem, but where are the conversations about the alternatives?
They've been foreclosed. Watching CBC News and watching a discussion last night of what can Canada do? Are our fossil fuel resources needed for Ukraine? That's a conversation without evidence. If you look at what Ukraine is asking for, you look at what the European Union is talking about, look at what Germany's talking about. None of them are saying, oh, if only Canada would build pipelines. They're saying we need to ramp up renewables. We need to move much harder and faster. Germany just accelerated its targets for renewable electricity in the context of the war of Russia attacking Ukraine. And our conversation in Canada is in some weird fossil fuel bubble, which is reinforced even by our public broadcaster, CBC, not to mention that the National Post and all those papers have a contract, an actual contract with the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers that they will push Canadian fossil fuels in any policy discussion in the pages of the National Post or the Financial Post. I mean, we have been in this country, I think conversation has been overtaken by a fossil fuel big oil propaganda machine that's been remarkably effective. So I in the debate upstairs in just one floor above me, where I had to come down here to find a space to talk to you, I'm appalled that we're still talking about getting fossil fuels to Ukraine. Petrostates and wars for oil undermine national and global security, and they always have. No one's ever fought a war, and no one ever will fight a war over who gets what share of the sunshine, who gets how much wind, who's able to control the tides. We have renewable energy that's a game changer. Solar is now cheaper than coal, and we are still, as a country, talking about building new nuclear, which is absolutely taking money away from renewables. And we're talking about expanding fossil fuels because Ukraine needs fossil fuels. No, Ukraine needs many things. We need to eliminate nuclear weapons. That would have been a good thing to have done some decades ago. Anyway, Jean, our conversation in this country is disconnected from the reality of where the European Union is, where Germany is, where Ukraine is. I mean, it's appalling to me that our national, last night, I don't know how many of you were watching CBC National News. I just ended up screaming at my television set. But it was astonishing that without any basis in fact, the conversation in Canada is shifting to, shouldn't we do more to develop oil and gas to send it to Ukraine, when that's not what they're asking for.
Okay, a powerful wake up to actually get active. For those of us on the call, remember that you should be writing letters. And if it's about renewables or the resiliency of our energy system or our responsibilities on the climate crisis, this is an important time to be heard. So yeah, thank you for reminding us about that. Okay, we've only got a little bit of time left. Maybe a quick response to that question. Maybe Anne-Josée, you want to go next, and I'll let Bob finish it up then. Thank you, Elizabeth.
The future, the question about the future. So I think what I put there, I want to share the audacious vision we have at Québec Net Positive. We think that by 2050, Québec could be the first net positive jurisdiction in the America. That would mean that Québec would provide more services to the planet than what its population and its businesses need to live and operate. We believe that the whole world right now is talking about net zero emissions. Many people are not committed to net zero emissions. Many people are not working on their carbon neutrality. So if we do want to achieve a net zero emission or even being at a 1.5 degree compliance or well below 2 degrees, as we tend to say right now, because we're really scared about this 1.5, that it's becoming very tough to achieve. What needs to happen is that there will need to be some companies and some jurisdiction that will need to be net positive to compensate for those who are not. And our scare with the net zero mindset right now is that it's kind of looking at how we operate our economies today and trying to reduce its footprint, but not changing the paradigms. And what needs to happen right now is we need to be thinking totally differently. We do not have all the technology to be fueling a green growth. Green growth is utopia right now. It's impossible to continue growing GDP while not emitting more GHG emissions. Then there's this idea of low carbon economy, sobriety. I think, I'm not sure the word in English, if it's the same, but that would mean that every consumer would change the way we consume. We would consume less, have less cars, go less in the air in airplane. So this needs to happen, but there's a challenge because it's a human behavior challenge to it. So I think between all the human behavior challenge and the technology challenges that there is, thinking that the economy can stay basically the same, but trying to reduce its footprint, it's almost impossible. So let's think totally differently. How can companies thrive by giving more than they take? And some people are working on this net positive movement, including Paul Pullman, who's the former CEO of Unilever, and Andrew Winston, who just published a book before the last COP on the net positive movement. Some companies are working hard at it. Why not even a jurisdiction like Quebec or a whole country? Canada with its territory, if we were to think, how can Canada give more to the planet than what we take from it? That's a different mindset. And by looking at this positive trajectory from where we are in the negative, thinking about a net positive mindset, at one point we will cross the carbon neutral landmark, but it's not something that we would strive for, that's very hard to achieve and we'll never achieve. No, we will achieve it because we need to think differently. So these trajectories are very important. Robert put his finger on it. It's to be really thinking differently about our purpose, the purpose of every business, every economic sector. How can it actually deliver more services to the planet than what it takes from it? That's a huge question and huge ambition. And I think it should kind of drive the thinking right now so that we think beyond net zero. As Elizabeth mentioned, the net zero is a tricky thing, I think, right now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We really just do have 1 minute left. Robert, do you have a sentence you want to share with us? Oh, you're muted.
Unmute. See, it's too hard for me, apparently. I think the essence of this discussion is about transformation. And I don't think historically any transformation has been easy, and most of them have been ugly. Secondly, I think everybody has to be more or less on board. And therefore, it's crucial to be thinking about this as a just transition, and probably crucial that it has significant positive upsides. I think it has to be fun. So we haven't talked about humor or joy in this a lot, but I think it's crucial. We've got a lot of people who are apparently unable to deal with having to get a needle and wear a mask. And when we're talking about the kind of transition that's required for climate change, for social justice, for better agricultural systems, for resilience generally, for fairness on the planet, you can't do that by force. It has to be a largely willing and embraced change. And I think the flexibility, the amiability, the collaborative skills of people who've done environmental work has been pretty amazing over the last 50 years. It's an area that has been remarkably free of ideologues who demand respect for one single simplistic idea. I think that may be part of the contribution the environmental movement can make to this broader transition.
Okay,
that and the comedians, I'm in favor of the comedians joining.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Not so much the comedians, but the role that we can all play as environmentalists. And this has been a wonderful discussion. I want to thank all of the people and that have been participating, Anne-Josée and Elizabeth and Bob. Thank you so much. And back now to Chuk.
Thank you, Jean.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Merci, y'all. Thank you so much, all of you, for that fantastic panel. Honestly, it was very riveting, and it was spectacular as a young person to hear what has been happening over the past 50 years, because I think oftentimes we do forget to look to the past, to look to see where we've come from, to see where we're going. And so, it makes me think of the words of Anne Paul, this whole idea of like, this is a relay race, right? We do what we can and then we pass on the baton to the next person to continue to push us forward. But in order to push forward in a good way, we need to recognize where we're getting the baton from, right? So that we're able to sort of coordinate that pass off. So I think this was both an incredibly necessary panel, but also incredibly enriching. And I just found it absolutely fascinating to hear that y'all have had more environmental success in the 70s and 80s than you're having now. And, hearing that this can be linked to the rise of neoliberalism, the ways in which we sort of allow corporations to get away with things that we may not have allowed corporations to get with a couple decades ago. And this phrase of we let corporate power trump democracy, I think was really, really interesting. I think also, I'll be remiss to say as a Black Canadian that I'm disappointed that the discussion didn't talk about race, right? Because in the past 50 years, race, it has definitely been a massive issue, right? So we didn't talk about environmental racism, even though I know that we recently sort of had a discussion in Parliament about the new Bill 226. We did not talk about environmental racism and how both private and public organizations and corporations have contributed to creating toxic environments for racialized communities, especially Black and Indigenous communities. We did not talk about how exclusionary the environmental movement over those past 50 years has been towards people of color, especially towards other worldviews, other perspectives, other ways of being, and has been very largely dominated by white Western perspectives. And we did not talk about the harmful messaging that dominated the environmental movement, which spoke to things like have less babies, which we know was code for, especially sort of the impoverished populations and specifically targeting Black and Indigenous communities who were known to having larger families. And so I love the way we ended, though, where we said that the essence of this discussion has been about transformation, and that transformation is incredibly important to be able to move forward in a good way, move forward in terms of the environment, move forward in terms of social justice. And so to all that are listening, take everything that we just learned, take in that knowledge, take in the wisdom that we are gaining from those who were leading the environmental movement before we were even born, before we even had the thought, before our parents even had the thought of our existences, and sort of coordinate that pass off, but also recognize what was missing from that discussion and incorporate it into your understanding of the last 50 years. Thank you all so much. Also, I'm just going to throw out a petit rappel for les francophones. There is
a brief reminder for the francophones, there is interpretation. So you can speak in the language of your choice.
By the Community Foundations of Canada. So please feel free to get to know your other conference participants, get chatting, get discussing. Feel free to join them at the network room roundtables. And then also take this moment to grab some food, have a stretch, do a little bit of yoga. I'm going to do a 10-minute booty workout. It's really fantastic, good for the glutes. And the next panel will start at 1 p.m. Eastern time, which is, give me a second, let me do the conversions. 1 p.m. Eastern time, which is what 11 a.m. Mountain Time, which is 10 a.m. BC time. Nope. Yes, I did that correctly. 10 a.m. BC time, and then it's like 2:30 in Newfoundland. God, I love Canada. Okay, networking break. Let's go.